What you're about to watch is a true story, an event that really happened to real people. This true crime account may be disturbing to both viewers and listeners. Thus, discretion is strongly advised.
What does trust mean to you? Is it your confidence in the systems designed to protect and guide us? Or is it the faith we invest in people, mentors, leaders, counselors, those whose very roles are to uplift and guide the most vulnerable among us? Now, imagine that trust, that foundation of security, being shattered. Imagine discovering that someone entrusted to help troubled youths, someone trained to be a beacon of support, had instead exploited their position in a way so egregious, so deeply unsettling, that it left an entire community reeling. We live in a society that often places authority figures on a pedestal. We assume their positions of power come with a sense of moral duty. And perhaps they do, for most. But what happens when that power is misused? What happens when the very person meant to protect becomes the predator? This isn't a question reserved for abstract philosophical debates. It's a very real issue, one that has surfaced in schools, churches, youth organizations, and, as in the story you're about to hear, the walls of a juvenile detention facility. The betrayal of trust in these spaces is more than just a crime. It's a ripple effect of pain, confusion, and loss. Today, we delve into a story that isn't just about a single individual's actions. It's a case that raises questions about how we oversee those in power, how we protect the vulnerable, and how we, as a society, respond when these safeguards fail. Our story begins in the suburbs of Illinois, in a seemingly ordinary community where the mundane rhythms of life were suddenly disrupted by a scandal that no one saw coming. In this quiet corner of Lake County, a woman named Bayleigh Hoyt stood out as a professional dedicated to helping troubled teens. At 28, she had built a career many might admire, working as a juvenile counselor for the Depke Juvenile Complex Center in Vernon Hills. Her job was one of immense responsibility, counseling minors who had found themselves on the wrong side of the law, guiding them, rehabilitating them, and giving them a second chance. For many of these juveniles, she wasn't just a counselor, she was a lifeline. These were kids who, for one reason or another, didn't have the kind of stability most of us take for granted. And Bayleigh Hoyt was supposed to be the person who helped fill that gap. But what happens when that role of trust, that position of influence, is twisted? What happens when the person meant to help a young person get back on track uses their influence to manipulate and exploit them? This isn't just a story about an individual. It's a story about systems and oversight, about the societal blind spots that allow such betrayals to occur. It's about how we as a community respond, not just to the crime itself, but to the deeper questions it forces us to confront. The setting for this story is more than just a detention center. It's a microcosm of society's attempts to rehabilitate and reform. These centers are supposed to be places of growth, where mistakes are turned into lessons and futures are rebuilt. But for one 17-year-old boy, the experience would become a chapter in his life marked by exploitation and betrayal. Bayleigh Hoyt began her role at the detention center in 2019. To most, she seemed like a dedicated professional. For years, she worked with troubled youths, building relationships that were supposed to guide them toward better choices. But as the years went on, whispers began to surface. Whispers that, at first, didn't seem to hold weight. After all, why would anyone suspect someone in her position of doing something so wrong, so utterly out of line with her responsibilities? The truth, as it would later emerge, was far darker than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just a case of poor judgment or a minor ethical lapse. It was a deliberate, calculated misuse of power, a betrayal that would leave an indelible mark on all those involved. Stay with me as we peel back the layers of this story, uncovering the shocking details of a case that has left a community grappling with the uncomfortable truth about trust, authority, and the lengths to which some will go to hide their actions. This is the story of Bayleigh Hoyt, a story that's about more than just one person's crime. It's about the cracks in the systems we rely on and the consequences of ignoring them. You're watching True Crime Stories 24/7. Thanks for joining. Please do well to subscribe and like this video to support us. The story truly begins with a boy. He was 17 years old, a teenager grappling with the kind of challenges that land young people in juvenile detention centers. Maybe it was a string of bad decisions, or perhaps he had simply grown up in an environment that offered him too few opportunities and too many obstacles. Whatever the case, he found himself inside the Robert Depke Juvenile Complex Center, a place designed not just to confine but to reform. In a perfect world, this would have been the turning point for him. Here, he might have found guidance, a path to a better future, and someone to help him understand that his past didn't have to define him. But in this story, the world is far from perfect. The boy's life changed again when he met Bayleigh Hoyt. She wasn't just a face in the crowd of authority figures at the center. As a juvenile counselor, her role was to be a guide and a mentor. She was supposed to be the adult who helped him see beyond his current circumstances. For the young man who was at a critical crossroads in his life, she represented not just authority but hope, a chance for someone to see him not as a case file, but as a human being. At first, everything seemed professional, appropriate even. Bayleigh was good at her job, perhaps too good. She had a way of connecting with the youths she worked with, of making them feel heard in a way many of them hadn't experienced before. And that's where the line began to blur. What started as routine conversations gradually became more personal. A text here, a casual comment there. At first, it seemed innocent, even well-intentioned. But over time, the tone began to shift. Bayleigh wasn't just a counselor anymore. She was something else entirely. Something the young man couldn't quite define, but instinctively knew wasn't right. After the boy was released from the detention center, the communication didn't stop. If anything, it escalated. What had once been professional boundaries now dissolved entirely. The texts became more frequent and more intimate. And then they became something else altogether. The investigation would later reveal the content of these messages, explicit photos that Bayleigh had sent to the boy. Photos that crossed every imaginable line of professionalism and morality. She knew what she was doing was wrong. That much was clear when she encouraged the boy to delete the messages in the photos. "Don't keep them," she reportedly said. "You don't want anyone to find them." It's a chilling statement when you think about it. It wasn't just an admission of guilt. It was a calculated effort to erase the evidence, to keep her actions hidden. Bayleigh was fully aware of the risks, fully aware of the consequences if her actions came to light. And yet, she did it anyway. Why? That's the question that lingers, the one that's so hard to answer. Was it a sense of power? A thrill of breaking rules? Or was it something deeper, something darker? Whatever the reason, the damage was done. The young man, a teenager who had already faced more than his share of hardship, was now at the center of a storm he didn't create. For a time, it seemed like Bayleigh's actions might never come to light. She resigned from her position at the detention center in January 2023, long before law enforcement became aware of what had happened. To the outside world, it probably looked like a routine career change. But behind the scenes, a much darker truth was waiting to surface. The turning point came when detectives from the Lake County Sheriff's Office received a tip. Details are scarce about how the case first landed on their radar, but once it did, the pieces began to fall into place. Detectives launched an investigation, meticulously piecing together the evidence. It wasn't long before they uncovered the full extent of what had happened. The explicit messages, the photos, the instructions to delete everything. It all painted a damning picture. When the case was presented to the Lake County State's Attorney's Office, the charges were clear. Official misconduct, a Class 3 felony, and distributing harmful material to a minor, a Class 4 felony. But Bayleigh wasn't arrested immediately. She had moved on and started a new chapter in her life. In December 2024, she took a job as a paraprofessional at Sherwood Elementary School in Highland Park. It was a fresh start, or so it seemed. Then came the arrest, on a Tuesday morning as the school hummed with the usual sounds of students and staff going about their day. Bayleigh Hoyt's past caught up with her. Detectives arrived at the school, and within moments, she was in custody. The school went into a hold, with students and staff instructed to stay in their rooms and avoid the hallways. For those who witnessed it, the scene must have been surreal. A woman who, just days earlier, had been hired to work with children was now being led away in handcuffs. The parents of the district were informed, their initial shock quickly giving way to outrage. How could this have happened? How could someone with a history like Bayleigh's have been hired in the first place? The answer lay in the timing. When Sherwood Elementary conducted a background check, there was no indication of an ongoing investigation. Bayleigh had not yet been arrested or charged, and the allegations against her were still under wraps. To the school, she was just another qualified applicant, someone who had passed all the necessary checks. But now, the truth was out. Bayleigh was immediately placed on leave and banned from school property. The community was left grappling with the fallout, not just from her actions but from the systemic failures that had allowed her to slip through the cracks. And yet, this was only the beginning. The legal battle was just starting, and the details of the case would continue to emerge, each one more unsettling than the last. Stay with me, because the story is far from over. What comes next is a courtroom drama that will force us to confront not just the actions of one individual, but the broader implications for trust, oversight, and justice. The day of Bayleigh Hoyt's arrest marked a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone involved in the case. As the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists and she was escorted from Sherwood Elementary School, the weight of her actions began to settle in the public's consciousness. What followed wasn't just a criminal investigation, but a community's reckoning with the uncomfortable truths about oversight, trust, and accountability. For Bayleigh, her world had turned upside down in an instant. She had been a respected professional, someone who had built a career helping troubled youths, or so it seemed. Now, she faced charges that carried both legal and social consequences of a magnitude she could never have imagined. The legal journey began the next day, as she appeared in court for her first hearing. This was no ordinary hearing, though. It marked the start of a process that would expose the intricacies of her actions, the lapses in oversight, and the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed someone like Bayleigh to manipulate the very system designed to protect vulnerable youths. As she stood before the judge, Bayleigh appeared composed, but the details read aloud in the courtroom painted a starkly different picture. The charges were clear: official misconduct and distributing harmful material to a minor. These were no minor infractions. They were felonies that struck at the core of her professional responsibilities and personal ethics. Official misconduct, a Class 3 felony, was a charge rooted in her abuse of power as a juvenile counselor. She had used her position not to guide or mentor, but to manipulate and exploit. Distributing harmful material, a Class 4 felony, was tied to the explicit photos she had sent to the 17-year-old boy, a stark violation of not only the law, but also the trust placed in her by the community and the juvenile justice system. The court heard how Bayleigh had actively tried to cover her tracks, instructing the boy to delete the incriminating messages and photos. This wasn't a crime of impulse, the prosecutor argued. It was a calculated effort to avoid detection. But, as the saying goes, secrets have a way of coming out, and Bayleigh's were now laid bare for all to see. Her attorney, if she had one at that point, didn't have much to say during this initial hearing. And for good reason. The evidence against her was damning. The text messages, the photos, and even her resignation from the juvenile detention facility before law enforcement got involved all painted a picture of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and the potential consequences if she were caught. But this hearing wasn't just about presenting the charges. It was also about determining what came next for Bayleigh. Under Illinois law and the guidelines of the Safety Act, the charges she faced were considered non-detainable. This meant that she would not remain in custody while awaiting trial. Instead, the judge ordered her release under Level 4 pretrial monitoring, the strictest form of supervision available. This decision sparked immediate controversy. Many in the community questioned how someone accused of such egregious actions could be released so easily. But the law was the law, and under the Safety Act, her charges didn't meet the criteria for detention. Instead, she was placed under strict conditions: no contact with the 17-year-old boy, no contact with minors, and no presence at any school, daycare, or juvenile center. Additionally, pretrial monitoring services were granted access to her electronic devices to ensure compliance. As Bayleigh left the courthouse that day, Escorted by law enforcement, the media frenzy surrounding her case began to build. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the public was left to speculate about what would happen next. For the parents and staff at Sherwood Elementary, her brief tenure at the school became a point of contention. How had someone with such a history managed to get hired, even if her criminal actions were not yet public knowledge? The school district's leadership, including Superintendent Mike Lubelfeld, quickly moved to address the issue. In emails to parents, they expressed their shock and anger at the situation, emphasizing that Bayleigh had passed a criminal background check at the time of her hiring. No one could have anticipated that just days after she started her new role, she would be arrested for crimes committed nearly 2 years earlier. "We are deeply angered and profoundly regret this situation," Lubelfeld wrote in one email. "We want to assure you that we are taking the necessary steps to uphold the standards and expectations of our district." But the damage was done. Parents were furious, demanding answers about how such a glaring oversight could have occurred. Even though the district had followed protocol, the community's trust had been shaken. It wasn't just about Bayleigh anymore. It was about the systems that had allowed her to work with children, despite the serious allegations against her. Meanwhile, the legal case continued to unfold. The Lake County State's Attorney's Office began preparing for trial, reviewing the evidence, and building their case. Every text message, every photo, every interaction between Bayleigh and the 17-year-old boy became a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that revealed the full extent of her actions and the impact they had on her victim. For the boy at the center of this case, the ordeal was far from over. He had already endured the trauma of being in the juvenile justice system, and now he found himself thrust into the spotlight of a criminal case that was as much about him as it was about Bayleigh. The legal process would require his cooperation, his testimony, and his courage to confront what had happened. And for a 17-year-old boy, that was no small task. As the story of Bayleigh Hoyt began to spread, it sparked larger conversations about the dynamics of power, trust, and accountability. How could a juvenile counselor, a position rooted in the protection and rehabilitation of vulnerable youths, turn into a role of exploitation? And what safeguards could be put in place to prevent such a betrayal from happening again? These were the questions that loomed over the case as it moved toward trial. And while the legal proceedings promised to bring some measure of justice, they couldn't erase the impact of what had already happened. The story of Bayleigh Hoyt was no longer just about one woman's actions. It was a mirror reflecting the flaws and vulnerabilities in the systems we rely on to protect our most vulnerable members. As the weeks rolled on, the case against Bayleigh Hoyt continued to capture the public's attention. It wasn't just the sensational nature of the charges that drew people in. It was the unsettling implications about who we trust with our children and what happens when that trust is broken. The legal proceedings moved forward methodically, with both the prosecution and the defense preparing their strategies. For the prosecution, the case seemed straightforward. They had the messages, the photos, and the damning evidence that Bayleigh had instructed the boy to delete it all. These actions didn't just suggest guilt, they screamed it. But cases like this are never as simple as they appear on the surface. The prosecution knew they needed to tread carefully. The key witness was a 17-year-old boy, young, vulnerable, and likely reluctant to relive the trauma of the events. His credibility would be scrutinized mercilessly by the defense, and any past mistakes or missteps would be weaponized to undermine his testimony. This wasn't just about what had happened. It was about how it would play in front of a jury. And then there was the public perception of the case. For better or worse, society often struggles to take male victims of sexual misconduct as seriously as their female counterparts. There's a pervasive, toxic stereotype that boys in situations like this should feel lucky or flattered, as though being exploited by an adult is somehow a rite of passage rather than a violation of their rights and autonomy. The prosecution had to combat this narrative head-on, ensuring the jury understood the true dynamics of power, manipulation, and harm at play. For Bayleigh's defense team, the strategy was less clear-cut. How do you defend someone when the evidence is this overwhelming? One potential angle was to argue that the explicit photos and messages, while inappropriate, didn't meet the legal threshold for the charges brought against her. Another was to paint Bayleigh as someone who had made a terrible mistake, but wasn't a predator, someone who had perhaps blurred boundaries inappropriately, but without malicious intent. But even as these strategies were being developed, the weight of the evidence was hard to ignore. Bayleigh's own actions had created a digital trail that was nearly impossible to refute. Every text, every photo, every instruction to delete the evidence was a nail in the coffin of her defense. And the prosecutors knew it. As the trial date approached, the media coverage intensified. News outlets dissected every detail of the case, from Bayleigh's resignation at the juvenile facility to her brief tenure at Sherwood Elementary School. Parents in the community expressed their anger and fear, not just about Bayleigh's actions but about the broader implications for how schools and institutions vet their employees. "I trusted the system to protect my kids," one parent said in an interview. "But now I'm not so sure. If someone like her can slip through the cracks, who else might be out there?" The public discourse also began to shift, focusing on the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed Bayleigh to operate unchecked for so long. Questions were raised about the hiring practices at both the Juvenile Detention Center and Sherwood Elementary. How thorough were the background checks? Could more have been done to uncover the allegations against Bayleigh before she was hired to work with children again? At the same time, there was a growing conversation about the need for greater oversight in juvenile detention facilities. Advocates argued that the power dynamics inherent in such institutions made them ripe for abuse, and that more safeguards were needed to protect vulnerable youths from exploitation. For the 17-year-old boy at the center of the case, the attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought his story into the light, ensuring that what had happened to him wouldn't be swept under the rug. On the other, it thrust him into a spotlight he hadn't asked for, forcing him to relive his trauma in a very public way. As the trial date neared, the anticipation reached a fever pitch. What would the court decide? Would Bayleigh Hoyt be held accountable for her actions? And what would justice even look like in a case like this? But perhaps the most important questions weren't about Bayleigh at all. They were about the systems and safeguards meant to protect young people like the boy she exploited. How had those systems failed? And what could be done to ensure they didn't fail again? The story of Bayleigh Hoyt wasn't just about one woman's fall from grace. It was a case that forced a community and a society to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, power, and the responsibilities we have to the most vulnerable among us. The answers to these questions wouldn't come easily, but one thing was clear. The story was far from over. The trial of Bayleigh Hoyt finally began under the glare of the public and media, and it quickly became apparent that this case was not just about legal justice. It was a reckoning for the entire community. Every detail that emerged in the courtroom deepened the questions and debates swirling around the case. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Journalists filled the benches, eager to capture every word, while members of the public sat in stunned silence as the prosecutor laid out the case. The story was already well known. A juvenile counselor accused of betraying her position and engaging in explicit communication with a 17-year-old boy. But hearing the details spoken aloud in court made it all the more real and horrifying. The prosecutor wasted no time in painting a damning picture of Bayleigh's actions. They described her as a woman who had deliberately exploited her position of trust, using her role to build a relationship with a vulnerable teenager, and then escalating that relationship into something deeply inappropriate. They presented the explicit photos and messages, ensuring the jury understood the calculated nature of her actions. "She knew it was wrong," the prosecutor said, their voice firm and unyielding. "She knew it was illegal, and she did it anyway." The prosecution also highlighted how Bayleigh had instructed the boy to delete the messages and photos, a move they argued demonstrated not just guilt, but premeditation. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment, they emphasized. This was a deliberate attempt to hide her crimes. The victim, now 18, was called to the stand. The courtroom held its breath as he walked in, his expression a mix of nervousness and determination. For many, this was the most anticipated moment of the trial. What would he say? How would he hold up under the pressure? His testimony was both heartbreaking and powerful. He described how the relationship with Bayleigh had begun, how it had felt like she genuinely cared about him, in a way few adults had before. "At first, it felt like she was the only person who saw me for who I was," he said, his voice trembling. "But then it started to feel wrong." He spoke about the messages and photos, how they had confused him and made him feel trapped. "I didn't know what to do," he admitted. "She was supposed to be the one helping me, and instead, she did this." The defense tried to undermine his credibility, pointing to his past mistakes and his history in the juvenile justice system. But the boy held firm, his testimony a stark reminder that his past didn't justify what had been done to him. The prosecution also called detectives to the stand, who walked the jury through the evidence they had gathered. They described the digital trail Bayleigh had left behind, from the explicit photos to the instructions to delete the messages. "Every piece of evidence tells the same story," one detective testified. "This was a calculated act, carried out over time by someone who knew exactly what they were doing." The defense's strategy, meanwhile, was one of damage control. They didn't deny that Bayleigh had sent the messages and photos. It was impossible to refute the evidence. Instead, they tried to argue that her actions, while inappropriate, didn't warrant the severity of the charges. They painted her as a flawed individual who had made a series of terrible decisions but wasn't a predator. "Bayleigh Hoyt is not a monster," her attorney argued. "She is a human being who made mistakes, serious mistakes, but mistakes nonetheless." They also tried to argue that the boy had been a willing participant, a point that drew immediate outrage from the prosecution. "He was a child," the prosecutor shot back. "She was an adult in a position of power. The law is clear on who is responsible in situations like this, and it is not the child." As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a microcosm of the larger societal debates surrounding the case. People argued over the lines between poor judgment and predatory behavior, between mistakes and crimes. And at the heart of it all was the question of accountability, not just for Bayleigh, but for the systems that had allowed her to exploit her position in the first place. The jury deliberated for days, their decision weighed down by the complexity of the case. When they finally returned, the room fell silent as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. Bayleigh Hoyt was found guilty on both counts: official misconduct and distributing harmful material to a minor. The room was a mixture of relief and somber acknowledgement. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. But the scars left behind by her actions would take far longer to heal. The judge sentenced Bayleigh to time in prison, emphasizing the betrayal of trust inherent in her actions. "You were entrusted with the care and rehabilitation of vulnerable youths," the judge said, "and instead of upholding that trust, you exploited it for your own purposes. This court cannot and will not tolerate such behavior." Outside the courtroom, the conversations continued. Parents demanded stricter hiring practices in schools and juvenile facilities. Advocates called for better training and oversight to prevent future abuses. And the community grappled with the fallout, trying to rebuild the trust that had been so deeply shaken. For the boy at the center of it all, the verdict was a step toward healing, but it wasn't the end of his journey. He had been forced to confront an unimaginable betrayal, and while justice had been served, the path to closure was still ahead. The story of Bayleigh Hoyt was over, at least in the legal sense. But the questions it raised about power, trust, and accountability would linger, shaping conversations and policies for years to come. It was a case that reminded everyone of the stakes involved when those in positions of authority fail to uphold their responsibilities. And it was a stark reminder that justice is about more than just punishment. It's about ensuring that such betrayals never happen again. The story of Bayleigh Hoyt is not just a tale of one individual's actions, it's a wake-up call. It forces us to confront difficult questions about trust, power, and the systems we rely on to protect the most vulnerable among us. How do we prevent abuses like this? How do we rebuild trust when it's been shattered? And most importantly, how do we ensure the voices of victims, especially the ones society often overlooks, are heard and supported? This isn't just about one case, it's about all of us. What would you do if someone in a position of power betrayed your trust or the trust of someone you love? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your opinions, and your ideas for how we can create safer, more accountable systems. If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with your friends, family, and anyone who needs to hear it. Let's spark a conversation that leads to real change. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future stories like this one. The conversation starts with us. What do you think? Let's talk.